So I'm here in the Azure portal. My app name is Creative Apps. In this lesson, we'll go ahead and learn about certain important features that the developers would love to incorporate while developing their web applications. But before that, let's take a look at these options on the right hand side. Now, the URL or the endpoint for my web application is this URL right here. Okay, so once I click on this URL, it takes me to a default page that looks something like this. But then once you have your own custom code, your own HTML and CSS and JavaScripts, you will have your own page here. But this is a default page that you see. Going back to your web application, you may be thinking about how will you upload your own HTML content. Let's say you have developed something on your computer, on your local machine, you've developed a mobile app or maybe a small website. How would you upload it to Azure Web Apps? Well, you will use FTP. Now, this is one of the traditional options that developers used to follow. Just open up your favorite FTP tool, like FileZilla is the most prominent one. Developers use FileZilla to connect to an FTP server, and the FTP host name is the highlighted section right here. So you will type the FTP host name. What you will also need when connecting to an FTP server is a username and a password, right? So anybody who knows the FTP hostname cannot upload content to the FTP server. They need a user ID and password, and I'll tell you where to get that in a minute. But think about automation. Think about continuous integration and deployment. Well, DevOps is becoming a big buzzword these days, where integration with Azure DevOps services, GitHub, Bitbucket is pretty common. So Azure Portal provides the out-of-the-box continuous integration and deployment features. And the place where you can get it from is the Deployment Center under the Deployment section. So if I click on Deployment Center, you will see the various CI/CD tools that you can use along with app services. You can use Azure Repos, which works in conjunction with Azure DevOps services. You can integrate this with GitHub, Bitbucket, and also local Git repository that is running probably on your development machine. All of these are for automation purposes. So what's going to happen if you connect your app to GitHub, let's say? Well, you will be automatically synchronizing the code from GitHub to app services. So you do not have to do anything manually via FTP server. There's a lot of flexibility that you get with DevOps. You can define your own build and release processes that will compile your source code, run the tests, build a release, and also finally deploy the release into your web app every time you commit the code into GitHub, for example. And all of this happens without any human intervention. This is what is called as continuous development. On the other side, there's something called as deployment or automated deployment is something connected to continuous integration. Continuous integration is a process that is used to push out, let's say, new features and bug fixes in a fast and repetitive pattern with minimal impact on end users. Azure supports automated deployment directly from several sources, as you see here. It works with Azure DevOps, GitHub, Bitbucket. So let's say you're using Visual Studio Team services to write your code and build your code. You can directly integrate to work with Azure DevOps. Lots of organizations have started to work with GitHub. So Azure supports automated deployment using GitHub. So when you connect your GitHub repository to Azure for automated deployment, any changes you push to your production branch on the GitHub will be automatically deployed for you. There are lots of similarities between GitHub and Bitbucket. So if you're configuring automated deployment with Bitbucket, Azure Web App will support that too. But let's say your organization is not that automation friendly and you're doing a lot of manual deployments, you got certain choices right here. You got local Git and FTP. So let's say you want to go ahead and work with a local Git repository which is running somewhere on your development machine in your network. So I'll select local Git here, click on continue, and I will have the options to select who my build provider is. It could be Kudu Engine. The K here stands for Kudu Engine, or you can use Azure Pipelines. You would use this when you have deployed an Azure DevOps server on your premise, right? So let's say I select Azure Pipelines and click on continue, and then you have to select the Azure DevOps organization, location, and various other parameters that connect to your Azure DevOps servers. On the other side, you can also select FTP. So that ways you'll be able to upload your content directly to this FTP endpoint using the credentials specified here. Now these are app credentials, and you also have user credentials which can be specified explicitly. Okay. So Azure App Services provides both the options to upload your content, synchronize your content using automation CI/CD tools, or manually as well. Apart from that, there is Azure CLI. So if I launch the CLI from here, make enough space for myself, there are CLI tools available, and you can use AZ web app up command to upload your content manually to Azure App Services. Azure CLI Web App Up is a feature of the AZ command line interface that packages your application and deploys it. Azure Web App Up can also create a new app service web app for you if you haven't created one yet. You can also integrate the app services with Visual Studio and deploy it right from there. So these are the various deployment options that we have. Remember that there are manual methods right here using FTP, using local Git, and also using CLI. Then there are automated methods that are all listed right here. Let's take a look at deployment slots in the next lesson and how it will be beneficial for organizations that have multiple environments.